Welcome everyone to CSR Talent Group's Insider Insights series. This webinar today is on climate and carbon reporting, developing a strategy and transparent approach. And we hope you all will walk away from today's session with some really practical ideas and thoughts about how to move your approach forward. So we've developed Insider Insights because we have a unique network of over 160 consultants in the network with a range of different backgrounds and experiences, including Stuart and Alexandra. And these are all vetted consultants that have previously, 95% of whom have worked previously in companies and have now pivoted to consulting. And we think they can provide a unique perspective on issues that you might not get from a typical webinar that has either a consulting firm or one company talking about their issues. Instead, we're trying to bring this range of issues to you from a perspective of somebody who's been both in a company and as a consultant. Some upcoming webinars that we've got, and they're posted on our website as well. The G of ESG, designing ESG oversight, and the future of employee engagement in the wake of the new normal. And we have a number that we're planning that we'll be posting soon. So please feel free to go to the website and sign up for an announcement that we can send you before every webinar. Today we have two experts with us who are, I think, very good examples of the 160 vetted experts that are in our network, Alexandra Uribe and Stuart Rassier. Let me take a minute just to give you a sense of their backgrounds. Alexandra is a sustainability consultant with experience in ESG ratings and carbon accounting. As a consultant, she's developed corporate sustainability strategies for companies as well as specific to individual consumer goods products. She's also developed a quantitative tool that measures the transparency of sustainability language to identify and reduce greenwashing. Stuart is head of ESG strategy at Think Parallax. Previously, Stuart has advised, trained, and consulted for companies, nonprofits, and foundations as CEO of Responsible Impact Group, Director of Executive Education and Advisory Services at the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, Regional Head of North America at Accountability, and Director at Saatchi & Saatchi Sustainability. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. As I mentioned previously, we're looking for questions from you in the chat. We asked everyone to submit questions before the webinar, so we have a number of questions for the panelists, but please feel free to write in a question to the chat if something comes up during the session. For those of you who have colleagues or people you know who couldn't attend today, we're recording the session, and it'll be posted on our website, and we'll send the recording to everybody who attends today. So let's get started. I'll ask Stuart and Alexandra to provide some initial thoughts about our topic today, and then we'll field questions for each of them. And each of them has some slides here, so we'll go through the slides and then have some questions afterwards. So Stuart, do you want to start?
Sure, Tom. Appreciate making the time. I think between Alexandra and I, we're going to have kind of two different approaches and conversations about the same topic and around carbon, around climate. And I think the piece that I'm particularly excited about is when I talk about sustainability, when I talk about climate and carbon, it's really about, as we're evaluating and assessing and really pushing our clients, our colleagues forward, we're really looking at two pieces. We're looking at performance and we're looking at transparency. And evaluating and assessing on that. And essentially this session is really getting into the nitty-gritty specifically around carbon and climate, and making sure that we're addressing not only performance, but also getting credit and being transparent about the work that's happening in the space. So I think it's a great way to kind of dive into the kind of why I enjoy the sustainability space so much. And also kind of illustrating the challenge of the space, right? This idea of performance and transparency in a constantly evolving and potentially more regulated space. So I think broad strokes, that's what I'm thinking, looking forward to. Alexandra, how are you approaching this call and webinar?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so for me, this topic is really kind of marrying two of my current infatuations. One is on the carbon accounting side, which is kind of the very technical aspect of calculating emissions for companies, for their operations, or for individual products. And on the other hand, we have the communication and the transparency and the need to be really honest within the sustainability world to kind of communicate not just with customers, but with shareholders and with any sort of external stakeholders and internal stakeholders as well. So for me, I'm kind of approaching it from from the technical aspect and then from the kind of external communication aspect.
Great. Well, thank you both for that overview of what we're going to dive into. So Stuart, do you want to start with your slides and get into it?
Yeah, and it looks like thumbs up. It looks like it's sharing. Great. All right, perfect. Well, so as we were chatting about this session and how we wanted to frame it up, we thought we wanted to provide some sort of very tangible content slides for the group to react to, potentially ask some questions. And as Alexander and I are going through these slides, they're sort of intended to be prompts to get the group thinking. And then I know, Tom, you've got some questions too for us as well. Yeah. So as we're going through this, essentially what I wanted to do is come primarily from the communication side of this topic and get us thinking about that. And we want to start sort of at the highest level and just talk about the value of communications for sustainability and ESG, dive in specifically into the carbon and climate. Spend a little bit of time looking at what I refer to as kind of the trifecta of effective communications. And again, this relates to ESG broadly and carbon and climate specifically. And then wanted to share two specific channels or two specific audiences that we see climate and carbon being communicated through. And specifically, we want to look at TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and spend some time talking about what seems like everyone is doing is making net zero commitments. So why make them? And then what does the communications around net zero look like? So that's four thoughts that I kind of want to share with the group and get people's reaction to. First piece in all of this, and both Alexander and I speak about this, is that we're all on a journey to make our companies, make our clients more sustainable. And when we're thinking about and going through this journey, we need to meet our clients, meet our colleagues where they are, meet our senior leaders where they are, and then help them along this journey. And I think Parallax, we look at this journey from novice to leader. And when we're talking about your journey around sustainability and around carbon and climate, really identifying, again, this idea of performance and transparency, or we talk about it as sort of strategy and communications. And you have to have both the strategy and the communications, or you have to have like the data, the policies, the processes, the governance around data. And you have to be able to marry that with authentic, credible communications. And so as we're thinking about what our journey is as it relates to carbon, essentially looking at two things. Like one, what are our processes? How are we governing? How are we reviewing? How are we pulling that data together? What is our strategy for carbon and data collection? And then also, how are we communicating about climate, carbon? How are we doing it through our ESG report, through a website? Is it more of an advocate role where you're starting to encourage others to assess their carbon emissions so that because it's part of your scope 3 emissions? Or are you taking stands? Are you advocating around climate policy at a national or global level? So all of these communications and strategy components to carbon and ESG generally are moving forward. And as you're thinking about your journey, you kind of want to move along the spectrum, and you want to do it at roughly the same pace, because the risk that you have, or the gap that you have in this, is if you over communicate about your climate commitments and your carbon, and you don't have the data, you don't have the governance, you don't have the review, you're at the risk of greenwashing. But also, if you've gotten really good at calculating, you have great processes in place around your carbon, but you're not leveraging that, you're not communicating that out through TCFD, through commitments, then there's a missed opportunity. And if you're doing it well, there's a real opportunity in this space to speak to, talk about, and get credit for the work you're doing. So understanding and assessing what's your strategy for climate and carbon, how are you communicating about it, and ensuring that they are at sort of comparable levels in the journey is essential as you're thinking about it. So I think that's one idea and concept we want to explore through the Q&A. The second piece to this is we're thinking about and talking about communications. When you're talking about communications, you always have to ask the question, who am I communicating to? And understanding who the audience is in all of this. And when we're thinking about creating an effective communication strategy for ESG or for climate specifically, and if it's strategic, you're essentially understanding and communicating to audiences around your performance. You're also potentially building reputation, and also potentially communicating internally, engaging with employees. Historically, when we've been thinking about communicating out about carbon and climate, we've often sat kind of in the far left here, right? It's been mostly focused on performance. And the opportunity to that is, like, if you're good at it and you have great data, you can start demonstrating performance. But the challenge you have is, the first question is, so what? So what does all this numbers mean? And for most of us, we don't have that data, that knowledge to really understand comparatively scope 1 and scope 2 emissions compared to one company to another. So I think that's one of the struggles we have in the communication space. But increasingly, there's more and more audiences that are interested in how you're calculating and communicating around climate. So from a reputation perspective, your customers, your consumers, your vendors, they're all having more conversations, more questions about what are you doing in the carbon space. And interestingly enough, I think with whether it's climate and carbon, but also I think about DEI and other topics within the ESG space, increasingly our employees are taking this communication in and are potentially more critical of it, because we've seen how the sausage is made. And I think one sort of illustrative example was working with a wind systems company with Vestas, and it's like, hey, we're creating renewable energy through wind, like we must be the most sustainable company in the world. But then if you actually talk to employees, like, would you actually know, like, what is the waste, all of the different water and waste concerns that they had for actually the different sites? Like, they're very in tune with what some of the gaps are. So as we're thinking about this effective communication, really understanding for strategic conversations, strategic communications, we have to talk about performance, but also think about how this is impacting our reputation and engaging with employees. It's kind of a second thought I want to share and with the group and thinking about that. So broad strokes, Tom, those are kind of two overarching ideas and concepts for the conversation. I also kind of wanted to share with the group two more specific channels that we use for communication around climate and carbon. One is thinking about how do our clients, how do our companies, how do they approach the task force for climate-related financial disclosures. It's something it's sort of the fastest growing framework that companies are referencing, partially due to the interest from institutional investors, partially because it's being integrated into international frameworks, the ISSB, those types of things. It's also referenced in part of the conversation with SEC regulation. So as a framework, as a tool, more and more companies and more senior leaders are saying, hey, we need to commit to TCFD, without necessarily knowing that is also a journey, right? Because there's a lot of significant expectations for reporting in that. Broadly speaking, as we're looking at kind of the journey for those that are making commitments for TCFD, they start early making these high-level commitments. They then move into putting an index or some type of appendix at the back of existing sustainability and ESG reports. That's where most of our clients are, where most companies are. As you progress along your carbon and climate journey, you start getting into more of the weeds around specific narrative responses, either in a specific ESG report. And in some cases, in particular financial institutions, but others with significant climate risk, significant climate performance are starting to actually create standalone TCFD reports, or in some cases, sort of net zero reports. And as we're thinking about, as you move along the complexity of your communications across the top, kind of the 1 through 4, if you look down below on this slide, you essentially see what a company does is they get better at calculating and understanding what their carbon and climate footprint is. So they're moving from early data collection, limited data around scope 1 and 2, and start building out their carbon muscle, and get into thinking about scope 3 emissions kind of beyond their value chain. And they start moving into essentially getting into like understanding how risk and opportunity and how climate is integrated into their business. So a topic, a channel of discussion around climate and carbon as it relates to TCFD. And kind of the fourth and final piece to this, and I kind of alluded to this because some companies are actually creating net zero reports. But what we're seeing and what we're finding is increasingly, I think increasingly companies are making and expected to make commitments towards net zero, and making reductions to that like an overall relative zero or near zero amount of carbon that's being emitted into the atmosphere by the companies. How a company goes about communicating around their net zero depends a lot based on who their primary audience is, how it connects with and aligns with the brand, and then also how they're actually, once they've made the commitment, what is the plan to get there? So if their plan, and it's kind of twofold, if the plan involves working closely with a lot of partners, working across their supply chain or across their customer base, that has a significant impact on how they communicate. The other piece that we see is that, quite honestly, it's like how good their plan is. Like if a lot of people are making commitments without a whole lot of tangible details to how they're going to get there. So that also has an impact on how one positions their communications around net zero. As we look across the field, we broadly see 3 positions or 3 personas of how people are communicating around net zero. We see those that are very data focused. We see those that are more focused on see themselves as educators in the space. And we see those that are more recruiters in the space. Recruiters, those that have like a larger scope 3, lots of vendors, They have to sort of cajole and get customers to be thinking about climate. They're going to be more in the recruiter space. Those that have made a commitment, but are still tentative or still feeling like they're still trying to figure out the plan to get there. And let's be realistic, no one has a plan to get to 100% net zero. But those that are more cautious about their position and what they want to do often take an educator role, like, hey, we're figuring this out. We've got a plan for scope 1. We've got a plan to get us to 2030. Let's figure this out together. That persona, that educator persona plays out in communications around net zero. And then the third one, the data focused. So that is often companies that are just by nature data focused, data driven, and IT companies, engineering companies, manufacturing that are more technical, more science-based, they're more likely to lean to that direction. The others that will lean to more of the data focus are those that actually have a really good plan or feel really confident and comfortable in their numbers, are more likely to tout those numbers. So 2 channels, 2 areas that we're seeing climate and carbon being communicated through net zero commitments and through these TCFD reports. Wanted to share, a handful of insights on that and kind of serve as a conversation. Tom, what have I missed, or what could be helpful to kind of keep the conversation going?
Yeah, I had a question. I want to ask you, for those companies that are starting out very early in their reporting and data collection, greenwashing, if I understand correctly, happens because there's pressure to report great movement or progress in the goals, when in fact they may not really have achieved much yet. So for a company that's just starting out and their competitors or other people in their industry are far ahead of them, how do you advise them on how to communicate where they are, what they're doing, in a way that's not going to bring some negative press or hurt their reputation with some of their key stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a good question that companies ponder often, and I think historically it's been okay to not talk about it or not publicize it. And I've been in the space now since like 2007, and a lot of companies in like the 2007 that like the vibe that it often gave was, well, it's just the right thing to do. We don't need to brag about it.
Right.
And that has shifted a lot in the period of time that I've been here in the sustainability space. And what we've been seeing is now if you're not communicating about a topic, the assumption is you're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
And in some cases, and so that's the assumption that generally stakeholders make. And then specifically, especially if you're a publicly traded company, you're now actually getting dinged for not reporting about it. So when I kind of frame this all up of this performance and transparency and how we assess, if you're not communicating about carbon and climate, or if you're not communicating about DEI or any of these other ESG issues, the assumption is you're not doing it. And in the case of sort of rankings and ratings, you're at the very least getting a 0 score and potentially getting dinged for not doing it at all.
Yeah.
So I think and I kind of frame it up as like that's the stick in this conversation and thinking about why to do it. And then the carrot is we're still in voluntary reporting space. You're still voluntary, using GRI. You're still voluntarily doing a TCFD report. So the opportunity to talk about this is there. You get credit for it, and we're still looking at the space as a journey that you're kind of moving towards. And this, I always use the kind of the idiom that lots in this space like to use, like it's about progress, not perfection. So putting out those initial communications, whether it's a report, whether it's responding to CDP for the first time, is do it, get your baseline, and then that becomes your starting point for measuring progress and sort of understanding what is happening. So those are kind of broadly how I kind of cajole and encourage people to move forward.
Yeah, a lot of good information here, and I have a bunch of questions, and we're getting questions as well. And I want to move on to Alexandra in a second, but I have one more question for you, given what you just said. Any thoughts about some of the anti-woke pressure that companies are receiving around reporting on not just climate and carbon, but all their ESG issues, given that we're talking about communicating and how much to communicate? Are you seeing any sort of response to that or backlash to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I laugh because I guess I give you my unofficial answer and my official answer. My unofficial answer is I'm personally not paying a ton of attention to it, because the political landscape has changed and evolves every 4 years, more or less, and that inconsistency really stresses companies out, right? So from a company's perspective, the only thing a company likes less than more regulation or is uncertainty. So for whether it's these frameworks or whether it's upcoming SEC regulation, this will come and go, but businesses are sort of wanting to establish consistency within the ESG space. So I think we will continue to move in that direction. I think the second component to this is this is definitely bubbling in the North American market. But as you look to European markets and other markets, they're all moving full steam ahead. So those will play that out. With all of that, and that actually is way more muted than I meant it to be, because the other parts, I've had been on so many panels before where they're like, is this sustainability? Is it CSR? What do we call it? And for me, it's just do the work, right? The work is the work. And that kind of transitions to what we are seeing is we are spending less. We are definitely talking to our clients less about what we call it, whether it's sustainability, ESG, and focusing on the actual specific issues and programs. And we're also muting or not using ESG language, in particular, financial services area, utilities.
Interesting.
And if you have a lot of sort of on the boots ground in red states.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer. Thank you for that. So let's go to Alexandra. But before we do, just reminder, if you have questions for Stuart or for Alexandra, put them in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will get to them. So Alexandra, do you want to present your slides, and then we'll go into Q&A after that?
Hi, Tom. Yes, thank you. I hope you guys can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, Stuart. I love hearing you talk about all those specifics on net zero and TCFD and how all of that relates to transparency and the sustainability journey. It's I tell all of my clients that sustainability is a journey. It's always a very daunting prospect for companies that are starting on any sustainability topic or however we define it. And it's good to see that, that you agree it's a very step-by-step process. Can you guys see the slides? All right, this worked a second ago when we tried it.
Yeah, I know.
Hold on.
We weren't seeing your cover slide, or if you want, I can pull it up.
That's okay. I got it.
Okay.
Okay.
Your patience.
Okay, let's see if this is going to. Excuse the technical difficulties, guys.
Okay. We
All
will
right, let's try this again.
There we go. There you
Can you see
go.
now?
Yep.
Perfect.
Maybe go to, yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Yep, perfect. All righty. So I wanted to address, kind of start off talking about, the problem with carbon accounting. Stuart already addressed a few of these components, just to give a bit of an overview. So there are a number of reasons why companies are starting to report on carbon and why it's become such a big topic. On the one hand, we have policies that are changing, they're constantly growing. Different countries have more regulations growing. Some regulations are related to specific companies or specific industries. Others are already specific to the types of emissions that need to be reported on. But all of this is like very much in flux right now. The second thing is investors and shareholders are in some cases requesting this information or asking for the companies to provide these reports. The other thing is there are external stakeholders. These could be like industry organizations that are really pushing for their members to be more transparent or to report on carbon. And the final thing is like internal pressures from employees. So a number of reasons why companies might want to really start taking carbon reporting seriously. There are a number of challenges associated with this, though. The first thing is carbon reporting is not simple. And what you're really doing is measuring like molecules in the air, which you can't see. So it's there's all these methodologies. There's a lot of guides out there nowadays, but it is not simple. It's not like simply adding 2 + 2, or it's not it's not like doing financial accounting where you can see the money flowing from A to B. The second thing is you need a lot of different types of data, and sometimes it's difficult to find, especially when companies aren't set up for this. Collecting this data is usually the first big hurdle that I've found companies having. Then the next part is once you find this data, sometimes it's incomplete. Large companies that have multiple locations around the world, they might not have the same methods or the same process for collecting this data. So you could be missing some information for some locations, but have more information for others, and we won't necessarily have the same, electricity or gas or other information that you need evenly distributed. Then the next thing is there's a lack of expertise to understand how the calculations are made. A lot of companies, particularly larger companies, they outsource the actual calculations to consultants, but they're still working together to collect the data to kind of do the work together with the consultants. But sometimes it's even hard for companies to understand and make sure and kind of follow through on what the consultants are doing or what the software provider or another service is doing. So sometimes it's hard to really follow along. And then finally, this is something that Stuart brought up too, is like, once you have this information, you report on it, well, sometimes there's like, companies are scared of like scrutiny from the public. So, why would we even do this is something that companies like conclude. So definitely sufficient challenges out there. But before I wanted to dig into a scenario to really express all of these challenges, but I wanted to start with a couple of key terms first. So just to make sure that we're all aligned on what I'm saying and I'm not speaking gibberish to you guys. So first of all, there are 3 different scopes of emissions. I hope you've at least heard of these 3. I'm not going to dig into exactly what they are or how to calculate them. I just want to give you a bit of an overview. So scopes 1 and scopes 2, generally easier to calculate. It is mostly from kind of your operations, has to do with fuel and electricity use, and the regulations that do exist generally kind of lump both of these together and have requirements on reporting on scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 3 is for the most part voluntary. There are very few countries where there's mandatory reporting. It is very complex. There are 15 different categories. Not all categories apply to all companies. A lot of it has to do with supply chain and like upstream and downstream from where you are. Talking about transport and like franchises and investments and business travel and all these things that are not really happening necessarily on site. So it is very complex, and this is usually where companies get very confused, and rightly so. Then the second thing I want to talk about is primary versus secondary data, and this is a really important part, especially as I'll talk about transparency and communication in a second. But primary and secondary data has a big effect on the calculations, in the sense that primary data is really what you collect from your own operations. You know, this could be from utility bills, like how much electricity are you consuming, what's the volume of waste that you're producing. You know, if you have business travel information, like it's specific to the distances that have been traveled. This kind of like really like raw primary data is what is ideal, but this is the kind of difficult data to find that I was talking about, that comes in all these different, it's in all these different places, it's not centralized. Versus secondary data, this is usually a little bit simpler. Often it's like spend-based data where you don't know exactly where everything came from, but you know exactly where the money, which supplier you spend money on, therefore you know exactly how much you spent on a material that you need to produce your goods. It can also be, if you don't have specific information on electricity consumption, you could get like an average electricity consumption per square foot in a leased building and kind of estimate emissions that way. So those are kind of the differences in primary and secondary data. The really key part is they don't come out to the same result. So if you do a calculation based on primary data, the result will be different from calculating based on secondary data. A comparison I often like to say is, it's like doing financial accounting. Using secondary data is kind of like doing financial accounting based on budgets. You know more or less where the money is going. You know more or less where the emissions are, but it's really not specific. It's not like doing accounts specifically on the inflows and outflows of money. So that's kind of the comparison I make between primary and secondary data. The next concept is a baseline year. So this is really important for companies that are like Stuart mentioned, a lot of this carbon reporting is still in the voluntary realm. Very little of this is actually regulated and required. So companies that are voluntarily disclosing their carbon reporting, their carbon emissions, they are generally, you know, setting targets. You know, companies are very kind of metrics oriented. They want growth, they want progress, they want profits. And in the carbon world, we want reductions ideally. But in order to calculate reductions, you need a good baseline year. So the baseline year is kind of the first year where you have complete calculations that you're using to compare to future calculations. Ideally, the baseline year calculations should use the same data sources and the same methodology, and include the same categories and scopes within the calculations so that you can compare apples to apples rather than apples to oranges. And then the final part is carbon reduction targets. Stuart did a great job of talking about this, so I won't bore you guys by repeating what he already said. But these reduction targets are very important, again, for companies that are voluntarily disclosing this, that want to make progress. And they can be aligned with, you know, net zero goals. It can be aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. And there are different ways of setting these targets. They could be based on like absolute emissions values, or they can be based on intensity, which is basically emissions on a per dollar or per thousands of dollars of profit, on a per employee or per square foot base. Just something the intensity targets tend to normalize for growth, essentially. Okay, so I'm going to go into a scenario or a comparative scenario between two companies. We have company A and company B. They're both software companies, like IT software companies. They're both really interested or are starting to calculate their own carbon emissions, and they use two very different approaches. They have assumed that they have kind of the similar sort of geographic, like geographic locations, similar sort of size. Company A and B both identified the same scope 3 categories that they want to include or that they think are relevant to their operations, as well as obviously scope 1 and 2, which is basically a standard when you're doing these calculations. So company 1 in the first year, they were able to identify primary data. So think, gasoline, fuel, electricity usage, etc. for scopes 1 and scopes 2. And then for scope 3, they only have one category with primary data. So they completed the calculation using secondary data for the remaining 3 categories. Company B, on the other hand, they have the same sort of primary data for scopes 1 and scopes 2, but were only able to find primary data for one scope 3 category and decided to leave the rest out. because they didn't have the methodology in place yet and they wanted to start with just a few things. So below you can see an example of the graph of what their emissions would look like. The darker column here is scope 1, the kind of lighter cream color is scope 2, and then this teal color is scope 3, right? So you can see that it seems like these companies would have the same total emissions, but they're getting very different results, based on the data that they have and the way that they're calculating this. So then in year 2, company A decided to, keep the same categories, but they switched one of their scope 3 categories, business travel, from secondary data to primary data. So they were able to get distance-based information for every single flight that an employee took, every single, train or bus, or any sort of drive that an employee made. So they were able to find exactly distance-based information for the year. Same with company B, they were actually able to find primary data for employee commuting, so through some sort of employee commuting survey. And again, for business travel, similar to company A, they were able to get primary data. And this means that the difference between the two companies is that the purchased goods category is left out for company B, but it's still included for company A. So company A has a bit of a mixed primary and secondary data set, and you can see that their emissions are similar-ish to the year before, versus company B, their scope 3 emissions have increased, obviously because they're including more scopes. So moving on to year 3, both companies are able to have primary data on both scopes 1 and 2 and all 4 of the scope 3 categories that they identified. And now they have primary data on all of this, and they were able to calculate their emissions. So what I want you guys to get out of this is that it's really important how you communicate about the data that you're collecting. Carbon accounting isn't just, yes, I did it, no, I didn't. It's very complex. There are a lot of different ways to do it, because most of the information out there on how to calculate it is based on guides. It means that there isn't a regulation that's not, carbon accounting isn't regulated like GAAP principles regulates financial accounting. So it's important to really communicate about how you're doing these calculations and what the differences mean. So, lesson number 1, it's really important to show that you have comparable data over time. And, you don't have to compare all the different scopes and the total emissions year over year. So company B, for example, could share their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions with it, for which they have primary data for, and they can show the progress over time, which is slightly decreasing. And just include scope 1 and scope 2. Their methodologies stay the same. They've been collecting the same primary data, and they included the same categories within both scopes 1 and scopes 2. Then next we have, company A's situation where they have included the same categories over the 3 years, but the way in which they collected this data has changed. So company A's scope 3 emissions look year over year like they decreased from year 1 to year 2, but then increased from year 2 to year 3. If you just present that data, most people will be like, well, what did you change about your operations that actually led you to decrease or increase your emissions? Well, the company didn't make any changes to its operations. They didn't actively try to reduce emissions in year 2 and then grew to some extent or made some other change that caused their emissions to increase. The way that they calculated simply changed. Similar for company B, over the years for their scope 3 emissions, their emissions didn't necessarily double from one year to the next and from year 2 to year 3. The extent to which they included scope 3 in their calculations changed. So they need to be transparent about that as well. I'm not saying one of these is better than the other. I'm just saying it's really important to be transparent about how you're doing these calculations. And at the end of the day, both companies A and B should really be using their 3rd year calculations as a baseline calculation for future target reductions, because it's hard for any of the companies to use their 1st year calculations as a baseline to compare future emissions reductions or increases. Okay, so a few tips and recommendations that I want you guys to have as takeaways. Number 1, it's really important to make a data collection and a reporting plan. Like I said, carbon calculations is very complex. It's really important to know exactly which Scope 3 categories you want to include over time. Sometimes it's not possible to include all of them, all of the ones that are relevant to your company in year one. So it's important to have a plan of saying like, okay, well, we're only including purchase goods in year one, and then in year two, we'll include, investments and franchises, or, there's 15 categories, there's plenty to choose from. It's important to pick the ones that are most relevant to your company operations. Then the second thing is you really want to develop data collection tools. So I kind of alluded to this earlier, things that allow you to collect really good primary data, for example, business travel forms. So a form that all employees fill out after they travel, so that you know exactly how far they've traveled, from which airport to which airport, so that you get as much accurate information on emissions as possible. And then the third thing is, in as much as possible, you want to standardize the data collection, so that you actually simplify the calculations. Again, companies that have multiple locations, they might have different ways of collecting information related to like utility bills. So finding some standardized way to collect all of this information regularly means that you're not scrambling at the end of the year to put it all in one place. And it also means that you're standardizing the units and the formats so that the calculations are significantly easier. And then in order to set targets based on all the calculations, one thing that I recommend, and I've talked to a lot of my clients about, is that you want to use, you definitely want to use a solid baseline year for your targets, but you don't have to use the same baseline year for the different scopes. You can have a separate target for scope 1 and scope 2 as you have for scope 3. So you can have a target to reduce scope 1 emissions that is separate from your target on scope 2 emissions, that is separate from your target on scope 3 emissions. No one is saying these have to be aligned. Again, this is mostly voluntary. So do it in a way that works for you and for your company. What is really important though is make sure that the results are comparable so that you can actually track your progress towards that target. And finally, most companies, they work in a world where they want to grow, they want to increase profits, they want to just grow on all fronts. So absolute value comparison is not necessarily the most helpful. So sometimes it's best to set targets based on intensity metrics, like I mentioned, like based on dollar revenue, number of employees, square foot size. Again, there are different metrics that work better for different companies. If they're manufacturing companies, their target might be best on a square foot basis versus a law firm where maybe it's best on a per number of employees, because their distribution of employees around global locations is a good proxy. And a couple of things that I want you guys to remember. Again, carbon calculations is not that simple. It is a little bit difficult. Know that you are accountable for the data that you report. So this kind of goes to my earlier topic, my earlier point on having external parties, external services, consultants, what have you, do the calculations. You still want to know what you're reporting on, and you want to know what is comparable and what isn't. So make sure you understand, or someone on your team understands, what these numbers mean, so that you can kind of move forward year over year. And ideally, you won't need consultants in the future. That's just a way to get you started. And also remember that reporting on scope 3 and setting targets is still voluntary, unless you're being requested by a client or by a partner, in which case it's theoretically still voluntary. Like there's no law requiring you to do this. Unless there's significant pressures, like you should take it step by step and do it slowly and do it well. And then the thing is, be transparent. Honestly, like reporting on carbon and reporting on a lot of these topics is, companies get very nervous about it, but be transparent on what you're doing. And it really is the key to gaining your customers' trust. All right. And with that, I'll leave you with a phrase that Stuart also iterated: sustainability is a journey. Take it step by step.
That's great, Alexandra. Can you stop sharing? Do you mind?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart and Alexandra. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions, but I just wanted to point out how terrific both of those presentations were. And we love the fact that you guys are representative of the types of people we have in our network at CSR Talent Group. So thank you for both of your presentations. So we got an interesting question in the chat, and it was coming up to me as you were starting to talk about this, Alexandra, and this can be for both of you. Somebody's asking about the incentives for companies to grow and expand over time seem to be at odds with goals to reduce carbon emissions. how can companies communicate improvements they did put in place despite increased emissions if they, for example, doubled in size year over year? So Alexander, you want to start on that one? And Stuart, you can weigh in too after that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a great question. And it is, very common. Yeah, the best thing to do is, I mean, be transparent. You can explain that your emissions increased because you doubled in size.
Yeah.
And a way, again, to normalize the results is by doing that on a dollar per revenue. Or you can show both. You can show the absolute emissions increase, but then maybe your actually emissions per dollar revenue decrease. So you can show them next to each other, and that is a great way of transparently communicating exactly that progress to customers and stakeholders.
And just to follow up on that, so when you're doing a baseline calculation after 3 years, you're taking into account that potential growth or the expected growth when you're setting targets, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, to some extent, you can't necessarily predict, right, what the merger and acquisition strategy is over the next 3 to 5 years for a company and those types of things. And it is, to Elisa's point, it's a tricky space to navigate when we're setting 2030 goals or 2050 goals. Yeah. Because even knowing what you're going to be doing in the next 2 to 3 years from a business perspective is sometimes unsure. I do really want hit on Alexander's point about the idea of intensity goals and metrics, right? And these are back in vogue. We spent a lot of time in the carbon counting and goal setting space moving away from intensity numbers and getting people to focus on absolute numbers. And it is back, and it was uncomfortable for me in the beginning, looking at the science-based targets, net zero goals, and the emphasis on intensity numbers. But the reality of business is that we need to have those in place to make them business friendly and to get corporations on board. Because we're not about to tell them not to grow or not to increase revenue. It doesn't make sense from a business perspective. Yeah. But I do think the other pieces, in addition to intensity, where I've been really pushing is, first of all, it's focusing. It's not just about your commitment, but it's also what is the plan, right? So spending time talking about the plan and very concretely getting companies to have a concrete plan for their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and incorporating climate conversations with the larger business growth strategy or the merger and acquisition strategy. Yeah. So make it one of the criteria for evaluation, thinking about that, getting into the details about what is the plan to get you there, I think are all key in all of this. The other piece to this to be thinking about is what are your opportunities of how you measure all of this. So looking at you're taking out some of the growth, whether it's an acquisition or changing your portfolio and reducing it. That's another one. You get credit for laying off half your workforce. Well, suddenly you have less office space. You have everyone's gone remote. Do you get credit for that from a carbon reduction perspective, or do you readjust your baseline? So I think those are considerations and thinking about. Last thing from a plan perspective, I think the 3 things, you set your commitments, but as you're thinking about your plan, it's about energy efficiencies and energy reduction. So what are those programs? What are those initiatives that are reducing your energy use? Yeah. How is that integrated? What is your strategy to move towards renewable energy? So that's the other piece. Can you incorporate a renewable energy strategy into your growth strategy? So I think that would be a second consideration. And then the third piece in all of this is to be having a conversation around carbon offsets.
Okay. Great. Very helpful. We only have a few more minutes left, but I'm just curious, you both talk about how important this is for stakeholders and the reputational value of moving forward and how to communicate. When you look at where the pressure's coming from, and we've we've had conversations where sometimes we all know that the only people who read the reports that you work on are you guys and people in the company. But where is the biggest pressure coming from on stakeholders who can have the most impact? Meaning, you talked about employees, Stuart, but do employees really get into the details here? And when the leadership of a company is thinking about what to do, who's the most influential stakeholder that you're seeing? And Alexander, let me start with you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the short answer is it really depends on the company and on the industry. Like, there isn't like a one size fits all, this pressure is exactly what everyone is feeling. I find that the thing that I hear most commonly is kind of the dull, kind of quiet noise from kind of the world being like, hey, this is something that companies are doing, and it's kind of the direction in which the world is moving. So it's kind of just a silent drumming and like everyone's ear to be like, oh, I guess I should do this. And it's kind of like a nagging on like your to-do list of, we should do our carbon accounting because everyone else is doing it, because everyone's talking about it, because it's constantly in the news. For a specific stakeholder, again, I would say it depends. Depending on the type of company, you could have investors that are really like actively involved, or that want the company to be a leader in sustainability. It could be that you're a forward-thinking company that hires a lot of millennials and Gen Z, and they really want their companies to be sustainable, and they're really pushing for the company to report and disclose and make changes to reduce their impact.
Right.
It can really depend.
Okay. Stuart, are you seeing any one industry that's...
I completely concur with the it depends, which people always hate that as the answer from a consultant. I think to go more specifically, I would say it's likely either the investors or your customers that are going to be pushing most to look for more credibility and more detail. Investor community thinking about it from the idea of investments, credit, and scores on your MSCI and ISS. So I think that's one, or potentially customers, because you're part of a larger value chain. And those companies want you to be more detailed there. And then I think what we find is it's the employees that hold you accountable, right? So if you make these commitments or you set these goals, that's where the accountability often comes in. When we look at scrutiny, we kind of dived in a little bit around, should we make these commitments for science-based targets or not? And generally, the upside of making the commitment is a lot better than any negative criticism that you would get. It's if you get criticized for going, it's usually relatively low in what's going, and the exceptions are in the financial space and sort of products that have green space. So that's the only exception where there's litigation in Europe.
Yeah. So we've got about a minute left, and I want to thank our panelists and everybody who's joined us, and remind you that we are recording this. So if you want to download this, or somebody who wants to listen, it'll be available on our website. But as a final send-off, Alexander and Stuart, do you have any final thoughts, any short statements you want to make about something you didn't mention or something you want to emphasize? Alexander, you want to start?
Rather than stating something new, I'm just going to reiterate what I said is just do it. Just start with something.
Okay.
If you want to go down the carbon disclosure or anything with sustainability, just start somewhere.
Okay. And Stuart?
And Tom, I think I want to amplify and reemphasize something that Alexander said earlier about just understanding and documenting how you've done the work, because I think that's important from two perspectives: how to do it, how to calculate it. Comparing apples to oranges is super important from the calculating perspective, but also from a sort of the credibility of your communication statements forward. The question that I always ask is like, how did you get that number? Or how can you make that claim that we're the most sustainable? Or so having the background information and then the assumptions you've made and the data to get you to that So understanding how you got there or how your consultant got there is key for both a calculating and a communication perspective.
Well, again, thank you both, and thank you everybody who's joined us. And anybody on the call, feel free to reach out to CSR Talent Group, myself or my colleagues, and if you have any questions or information you want to get, and we'd love to help you find a great consultant. These are two that are in the network. You guys did a great job today, so we really appreciate it. And we will keep in touch with you all about future webinars that we've got coming up. All right, thanks again, everybody.